for you in your wherever you're doing your education practice. My name is Rich Halverson. I'm a professor here at UW-Madison, and I wanted to share with you some ideas on some changes that are in the air for basically learning environments and learning environment design that will influence how our young people both are prepared for and thrive with college readiness and college success. A lot of my comments today are going to be based in my experiences with the three groups that you see here on the screen, which I'll just talk briefly about and then come back to later. GLS is the Games Learning and Society Research Center. It's been since 2003. It's been one of the world's leading organizations that helps think about the relation between digital media and learning. We study video games to understand their design principles and to figure out how we can use those design principles to reform the design of new learning environments. CALL, the Comprehensive Assessment of Leadership for Learning, is a project that I started in 2007 with my colleague Carolyn Kelly here at UW-Madison. It's designed to hit a sweet spot in the way we think about assessment in the K-12 world, trying to give school leaders and educators some good feedback on the kind of conditions that they see as necessary for improving learning for all students. And as I'll talk a little bit later, these sort of formative assessment tools that give feedback to the people in learning environments are going to be really important as we move forward for educators, but also for learners. And the last organization is Network Ed. I started this organization at UW with my colleague Jack Jorgensen about 2 years ago, and it's designed to create new kinds of partnerships with schools of education so that we can continue the process of redefining schools of education in terms of service and outreach and influence on practice. In the recent past, we've had a lot of emphasis on research that's designed to inform practice, but we don't think as much about practice that's designed to inform research. The Network Ed group is designed to create connections on both sides, both among smart practitioners interested in innovation, but also researchers who are interested in having influence in the world and creating new kinds of social capital that transform schools of education. So my talk today starts off with this interesting graphic, sort of a representation of the Google work calendar, where Google has this sort of innovative model for how to organize people's work time, where 80% of the time is company time and 20% of the time is for you to develop your own ideas. And I'd like to use this metaphor to talk about how we think about education research typically in education research organizations. A lot of the time we think about education research and improvement in terms of problem solving. Problem solving is really important because most of the work that we do in improving the conditions for teaching and learning have to do with the implementation of ready solutions, solutions that have already been tested and shown to work in other contexts. However, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the area of problem setting as well. And problem setting is determining which problem you want to solve. And I think a lot of the most interesting work that you see in education research and education innovation has to do with determining the solution to problems that haven't yet been identified. I think a lot of folks, like in the U.S. Department of Education and some of our state departments of education, feel that problem solving is the work of most educators, that we have the solutions, we have data, and basically what we need to do is implement with fidelity. However, in recent years, I've come to think more about the problem setting side of education innovation. What if the kinds of problems that we are commissioned to solve as leaders in the education space, what if we haven't defined those yet? What if the solutions that we propose are part of the problem? How do we get out of the problem solving set and think more about problem setting? So today I want to talk a little bit about some of the problems that are in the making, some of the things that that are sort of a pervasive sense of not failure, but a pervasive sense of where our system is falling short. We can think about our work in terms of optimizing the present system by implementing the solutions that already work for us, but how do we start thinking about the problems that need to be addressed? Richard Sennett is a researcher at Harvard, writer at Harvard, who in his book, The Culture of the New Capitalism, really talked about the idea that the kind of problems that we're going to be facing in the 21st century are problems of the limits of our institutions. And he calls attention to how we can revive our institutions, or whether we can revive our institutions to meet their own limitations. Sennett talks about how that the current sort of education and the economic complex, he calls it the vocational economy, and he says it still leaves behind the majority of young people and adults. He says that he comments that the education system turns out large numbers of unemployable, educated young people. At least they're unemployable in the domains for which they have trained. And if you've been following the discussions about the work lives of the millennial generation, you'll find that we have a group of young people who are as educated as any have gone before, but also whose wages are falling pretty far behind their predecessors. And so Sennett's point is, given that the current system that we're trying to optimize is reaching its limits, where do we get our new ideas from? Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee at MIT talk about the influence that technology has had on bringing about this world where we're seeing the limits of our institutions in the book, The Second Machine Age. They talk about how productivity has gone up in recent years, but employment has not caught up with productivity. So as you see toward the edge of this screen, as technology creates a more productive workplace for us, fewer and fewer people are being employed in that workplace. This is a graphic from Frank Levy and Richard Murnane, who wrote this in a book in 2006 about the future of the workforce. They talked about how the kinds of jobs that are going to continue to grow focus on complex computation and expert thinking. But the majority of our jobs are in routine cognitive, routine manual, and non-routine manual pieces of work. And so as the area of the economy that's growing is not the majority of our jobs. And this is also reflected in the work of a British sociologist named Guy Standing, who talks about the emergence of a group called the precariat. He calls it the new dangerous class. And when Sennett talked about the overeducated, underemployed young people, this is what Standing means by the precariat. The unemployment rates in Europe, which are not as bad in the U.S., but they're similar. You could see that some of the unemployment rates in some of the European countries is up around 25%. But this is an interesting slant on the precariat as well, is that while the unemployment rate in the U.S. is about almost 10% as of 2012, I think this was, 2010, the underemployment rate is hovering around 16%. So for practical purposes, you have about 25% of workers in the U.S. who don't have enough to do. They don't have enough wages. They have to work multiple low-wage jobs in order to get ahead. This is a sign, this is another example of this in 2013 among young college graduates, where it's even higher. It's up around 27% are either underemployed or unemployed. We've had some public movements about this in recent years, both on the right and the left, talking about the lack of opportunity, the degree to which the wealth split is happening in the U.S., where you have the small group of people owning and controlling the capital that the rest of the folks don't get to participate in. And this leads us to kind of a problem when we think about education, because the model that we have in education more often than not is, how do we take the tools that we have and implement them appropriately to create opportunities for young people? The typical problem-solving move in education is to try harder and to optimize better, to implement with fidelity, basically to take the tools that we have and to work really hard to get them right. But if Sennett and Brynjolfsson and Standing are right, then it doesn't matter how much that we do problem solving, we're going to have to figure out how to set the problem differently so that we come up with a different generation of solutions. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas in the 1970s talked about this idea of legitimation crisis. For Habermas, legitimation crisis happens when a public institution makes promises about the outcomes of its work. And when the institutions start writing checks that can't be cashed, you have a system crisis in the institution and a legitimation crisis in the public discourse. Habermas wonders a lot about how social systems change. And one of the ways that changes happen, I'll give you an example, is in the 1970s, we had a similar kind of system crisis around energy. Remember that some of you guys are old enough to remember the long gas lines in the 1970s. I'm just looking up at my bulletin board right now. I have a picture of my first car, which was a 68 Oldsmobile Delta 88 with a giant engine that could probably take off with an aircraft, or make an aircraft take off. People in the 1970s thought in America talked a lot about stagnation, talked a lot about the culture of despair. And then, out of nowhere, it seemed, we had innovators who came up with an entirely new branch of economic development and intellectual endeavor. The development of the PC and the Apple and Microsoft. We know this is a very familiar story to us. But the point here for system crisis is that often the solutions for system crisis come up completely off the radar, not within the conventional discourse at all. And I want to talk about some of those sources of system revival that we see in the U.S. and the global economy today. And these are the things, I think, that have the potential of giving us some of the ideas that can help reframe what we mean by education and come up with new ways to set the problem of how to prepare young people for careers and vibrant new lives. What are the seeds of this new system? As I mentioned before, there's interesting activities in learning and work that are at the margins of traditional education. This is sort of like what happens when a system shift is sort of a gestalt shift where the field becomes the ground, where the practices that are taking place on the margins suddenly become in the mainstream. I'd like to talk about three of them today: personalization, participatory cultures, and peer-to-peer interaction. So first, let me talk about personalization. Often when we think of personalization, we think of personalized learning in schools, which is setting up young people with virtual tools like Khan Academy that help them learn the things that they're supposed to learn in school. So you have traditional chemistry outcomes, math outcomes, writing outcomes, and there's a whole bunch of virtual tools now that you can use to help personalize, build learning environments for students so that they can get to their school goals. However, I'd like to introduce a different way to look at personalization for a minute. Just go along with me. Young person, Cheryl, who's doing her homework at her computer. She has her traditional materials that are supplied by her district, by her school. She has her textbook. But a social community that it's very important that she interacts socially around the content with her community. But Cheryl has a difference in the 21st century because Cheryl has Wikipedia. And sites like Wikipedia provide an alternative representation of the content that she's learning in her school. Also, she has virtual study groups, virtual communities that she can use for resources, for hints, for answers to the questions that she's looking at. She also can interact with alternative media, alternative video representations of the content. Khan Academy would be one, but companies like Brightstorm also have alternative representations of content. She also interacts with people synchronously through tools like GChat. If you look at this picture, you can see that Cheryl is personalizing her learning by creating a virtual network of tools around her. Basically, she's designing her own learning environment. And this kind of personalization it's sort of a perspective of personalization by students rather than for students. Young people today and adults live in worlds that are mediated by virtual information tools. And as institutional leaders, we can continue to consider questions of personalization, but by looking at how do we build tools for our students. But if we look at the experience of young people like Cheryl, we should understand that a lot of our work should be a partnership with learners so that we can work with them to support the tools that they choose to amplify their own learning, amplify their own learning experience. This is here, let me cut over this one. The idea of connected learning talks a lot about how do we put learners in the middle of communities of inquiry, tools for knowledge tools and knowledge building to sort of make learning about how to connect learning resources within the institution and across institutions. Anya Kamenetz wrote about a book called DIY-U about how adults are taking this approach to the design of their own learning environments with their college experience. This is specifically non-traditional students who take some classes at a community college, some workshop classes, some university classes to customize their own learning environment. And the badge movement is coming right along with the DIY movement to legitimate the self-constructed learning paths that learners are starting to develop. Where personalization focuses on the activity of individuals in a learning environment, participatory cultures is a really powerful idea that talks about the inherently social side of participating in new media learning environments. Henry Jenkins wrote this book, this report, and I strongly encourage you guys to download this. It's great. It's called Confronting the Challenges of Participatory Culture. It was written in collaboration with the MacArthur Foundation in 2006. And the idea here is that the stereotypes about how people interact with digital media are almost always wrong because digital media are inherently social. And Henry Jenkins and his colleagues talk about what are the dimensions of social that happen with interaction with social media. An example of this is Pinterest, where many educators now have sort of co-opted this resource sharing tool to share lessons, to share strategies about practice, new ideas for teaching. It's an example of how participatory cultures can grow up around traditional tools and how educators can co-opt these kinds of resource sharing tools for their own purposes. Another example of this is citizen science, crowdsourcing science. This is an example from the Tufts University, the veterinary school, where they needed to do seabird censuses, and so they have hundreds and hundreds of people going to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean to try to count seabirds, and that all becomes part of doing real science. Participatory cultures emphasize how communities can engage in primary knowledge production. And of course, we all know about Minecraft, which started off as a video game and has blossomed into an incredible learning resource for young people, as you can see from this screen, where you could pick lessons in almost all the disciplines and almost all the age levels to teach specific concepts, but also teach exploration and 21st century learning skills. Participatory cultures focus on a couple of key ideas. The first one is there's an authentic audience. In this case, we mean that so often when we have homework in schools, the only audience is the teacher. An authentic audience is other people who care about what you do, right? Where you're trying to make things that matter to a larger group of people. There's access to mentoring because participatory cultures are typically multi-age and multi-ability. They're organized around open questions. This is a real difference between participatory cultures and schools. In a participatory culture, you're investigating something that's not known, like the citizen science project that we just saw, like fantasy sports where you're not really sure which teams, which players are going to do better, but you make your bets in collaboration with a larger group of people and try to figure out what's going to happen in the future on the basis of the group that knowledge shared in the group to which you belong. Quality contributions matter. If you don't participate, then you're not seen as a viable member of the community. There's scaffolded participations for people to slowly engage with new content. This is the participatory cultures idea, I think, is the social learning platform for the 21st century skills movement. It's the idea that you can't develop the kinds of innovation, career skills, and technology skills in traditional school context. You have to have a new model of social interaction that I think the participatory cultures idea really helps us understand. The last idea that I'll talk with you today about is the P2P world. The P2P world really focuses on how people can create resources that other folks can use for learning. We see this in the development of massively multiplayer online courses like, or massively open online courses like Coursera, where you have educators in one part of the world putting up courses so that anybody can participate in them. Also through sites like Code Academy, where anybody can learn coding. You can learn the basics of coding in all of the main languages for free with an interactive interface that allows you to progress in your skills with the help of a computer system and other learners. Clay Shirky talks a lot about the P2P world in his book Cognitive Surplus, where he says that for most of us, especially most of us in the West, we have a lot of leisure time, and the leisure time can be spent on, is increasingly spent on cognitively challenging activities. And if we can put the time that we spend in leisure into knowledge building activities, we can make all sorts of resources and all sorts of work that is engaging for people, even though you don't get paid for it. Shirky's work and others emphasizes how the connection between vocation that we have and we traditionally have had and meaningfulness in our work are starting to split from one another. The things we get paid for and the meaningful activities in which we engage are going in different directions. Michael Bowens talks a lot about the P2P culture. He's a researcher at the University of Amsterdam, and he talks about a lot of his work on a site called the Commons Transition, which is, as he says here, a database of practical experience and policy proposals aimed at achieving a more humane and environmentally grounded mode of societal organization. This idea is based on peer-to-peer dynamics, which are the people who make the resources and the people who use the resources connect directly with one another outside of the mediation of capital. So the peer-to-peer idea is that meaningful learning activities can be built and engaged in by people without the mediation of institutions. Things that he talks about, environments like Linux and Wikipedia as prime examples. There's a group here at the University of Wisconsin that's developing what's called microgrid systems, which are energy systems that can be built out of generic parts. So you can have complex and very robust energy production in third world developing countries for not very much money at all. And one of the leaders in the P2P world in education is Neil Gershenfeld with his idea of the Fab Lab. Fab Lab is about a $10,000 set of design tools, computer generation tools, welding, circuit boards, 3D printers that anybody can use to create really sophisticated production capacity for anywhere in the world, basically. And one of the cool things about the Fab Lab movement is that the blueprints for using the Fab Lab hardware is free. It's basically distributed on websites all around the world. Fab Labs are springing up. This is from a couple years ago now. They're springing up all around the world as a way to get very high-tech, cutting-edge production capacity to people in all different kinds of countries. So I talked a little bit about the P2P, participatory cultures, and personalized learning, and how those areas seem to be on the edges of our contemporary education space. But I think they may create new kinds of ideas that open up the possibilities for setting problems about education in a different way. Stephen Johnson wrote this, I think it's a really interesting book, Where Good Ideas Come From, A Natural History of Innovation. And he talks about how, this is his motto, chance favors the connected mind. He talks about the development of what he calls liquid networks. And liquid networks are communities of inquiry where people are trying to solve similar kinds of problems, not identical problems. So like in our world, perhaps you'd have special educators working alongside community college developers, working alongside learning scientists, working alongside digital media developers. All those people are trying to come up with new opportunities for young people and new career opportunities for people who graduate from our education spaces. When those networks are allowed to connect with one another, where they can start sharing insights from each other's worlds, new possibilities open up, new ways of framing the problem for potential solutions can open up to those existing communities. Liquid networks connect innovation communities in pursuit of answers to related but hard problems. And I think the ideas of personalization, participation, and peer-to-peer networking are really good opportunities for us in education to start connecting with folks who do this kind of work and let their grounding assumptions and their solutions move over into our work so that we can better understand the possibilities of how we can reframe our institutional work to address the needs, the emerging needs of young people. The problem with a problem-solving strategy is that even when you optimize your institution, there's always going to be people left out. As leaders of education institutions, we have to constantly be on the alert for problem-setting opportunities that allow us to see new kinds of problems. And we're in a fortunate situation in education because there's so many different people who are trying to work in the education space, including folks in personalization, participatory cultures, and P2P worlds. If we start partnering with folks with expertise in those worlds, people like Nicole Pinkard and Sam Dyson in Chicago, who do work on the UMedia and the Hive network, and people who work on the Illini Cloud network in Illinois, those folks can help us see the problems of our spaces in new ways that open up new possibilities. I said earlier in my presentation, a lot of the insights that I've gotten from my talk today came from working, for example, with GLS, with working with folks who develop digital media spaces, so that the assumptions that they make about learning are not the assumptions that we make about school learning. And how can we start to learn from across those ideas? And the network ed space, which I've been spending a lot of time in lately, which is basically take Stephen Johnson's liquid capital network idea and makes an institution out of it, where our job is to connect people who are doing parallel but related inquiry so they can start to learn from one another and open up new kinds of problem spaces to help solve the issues of the needs of young people in education today. All right, those are my comments for today. I'll be glad to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Halverson. I appreciate that. If you would, I believe I need you to click and turn control um, over to me.
Let's see, you're the organizer, right? Okay.
Right.
How's that?
That works. Okay. Very good. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Halverson, for the presentation. And we are at the question and answer portion of the webinar. A couple of you had some problems seeing slides. We will send those out with the recorded portion of the webinar. But at this point in time, if anyone has any questions, we would be glad to take those. And I will also unmute everybody so that they can verbally ask questions. All right. All right. Do we have any questions for Dr. Halverson? We have one question here, Dr. Halverson, that came in on the chat portion of our webinar. They wanted to, when did you start seeing these changes in education and what led to your this area of your research?
I was thank you for the question. I was a high school teacher and principal on the south side of Chicago. Those of you who are familiar with that area, I was at 159th Street in the Dan Ryan, so almost in Indiana. And I was there during almost all of the 1990s. And I started seeing, it was a small Catholic school, and I started seeing a real disconnect between the kinds of skills that young people were asked to use in their college and their careers and the kind of things we were teaching in high school. So I went to grad school at Northwestern, and I had a really great experience. I went to a program called the Learning Sciences at Northwestern, where they tore down the boundaries between computer science and cognitive psychology and education. And so it was one of my first really clear examples in how the ideas of one domain could inform the questions of another domain. And that sort of collaboration isn't easy, because that same thing also leads to a mismatch where people don't understand each other very clearly. But the kind of assumptions that cognitive psychologists and computer scientists make about education are very different than school people. School people see constraints all over the place, like we have to do this because of special ed. We have to do this because of the transcript system. We have to do this because it's the college pathway for young people. So there's a lot of have-tos. And I think participating in these sort of interdisciplinary communities allows you to see those constraints of our practices as affordances. You start to think, well, I get that I have to do it that way, but these folks don't think about it that way. So could I think about it in a different way? And since then, I've been really fortunate to be able to participate in a number of education communities. A number of education communities that support that sort of interdisciplinary inquiry.
No, Wednesday I'll go straight, but today I came here first. Monday I told our dog, I need to come here and get things anyway. I can't think I can leave on Friday and be good, so.
I'll find that one and mute it.
I'll go there straight, unlock.
There we go. Okay, I'm sorry, Dr. Halverson. Go ahead.
Nope, that's good. Do we have any other questions?
Let me go down and check the question and answer screen as well as the chat screen.
While we're waiting, if any of you want to, if any of you are interested in following up on these ideas or any of the programs that I talked about, please please contact me. I'm
Waiting your
easily available on Google.
Now, should.
Yep, there's my stuff.
So it's Rich at rich.halverson, HALVERSON at WISC.edu.
Yep.
Dr. Halverson, we thank you so much for your presentation this morning, and we greatly appreciate you sharing this information. I want everyone to be aware that we will
Well, thank you very much, everyone.
I want to remind everyone that we will be recording today's slides and posting them to the website. Also, feel free to email Dr. Hackman at djhack@illinois.edu, and I'll be glad to send you a copy of the webinar, recorded webinar and slides as well. Thank you so much again, Dr. Halverson. We appreciate all that you've shared with us, and our webinar will be coming to a close. Have a good day.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.